When you hear the word assassin, you may imagine speed, confidence, and control, a silent figure moving through shadows with perfect precision. You may imagine skill and purpose, a life chosen and mastered. In the medieval world, the reality was slower, colder, and far more uncertain. If you were an assassin in the Middle Ages, your life was not sleek or efficient. It was uncomfortable, poorly paid, often short, and full of waiting, fear, and mistakes that could not be undone. You were not part of a formal profession in most of Europe. There was no official training school, no handbook, no guild that proudly listed your trade. In fact, if anyone openly described you as an assassin, your life expectancy shortened immediately. Killing for hire was illegal in nearly every medieval kingdom, even in times of war. Most assassins were simply desperate men, sometimes women operating on the edges of society, hired quietly by nobles, merchants, or political rivals who wanted a problem removed without witnesses. You likely began as something else. A soldier discharged without pay, a servant dismissed from a household, a criminal facing punishment, a man with debts that could not be repaid. You did not wake up one morning and decide to become an assassin. You were pushed there slowly by circumstance. Hunger was often the first motivator. Cold followed close behind. When a man offered coin and protection in exchange for silence and violence, the offer could feel less like a choice and more like survival. Your equipment was rarely impressive. A small knife, perhaps a short sword if you were lucky. Poisons existed, but were expensive, unreliable, and dangerous to handle. Many so-called assassins died from their own tools, accidentally contaminating food or cutting themselves during preparation. Protective gear was minimal, because armor was noisy, heavy, and suspicious. Blending in required looking ordinary, which meant you were vulnerable to every blow. The hardest part of your work was not the killing itself. It was the waiting. You waited in doorways, alleys, barns, and stairwells. You waited in cold rain and damp fog. You waited while rats moved near your feet, and the smell of waste settled into your clothes. You waited for hours, sometimes days, with no guarantee the target would appear. If they did not, your employer might refuse to pay. If they did appear, the moment passed quickly, leaving you with a body and a problem. Escape was never guaranteed. Medieval cities were dense, confusing, and heavily watched by neighbors. People noticed unfamiliar faces. They remembered accents and clothing. There were no crowds large enough to disappear into easily, especially at night, when doors were barred and streets were quiet. If someone screamed, the sound traveled far. Bells rang quickly, and once they did, gates closed. If you were caught, there was no romantic trial. Torture was common and public. Authorities were less interested in who hired you than in making an example of your body. Execution methods were slow and designed to discourage imitation. Even if you survived capture, your name was ruined permanently. You could not travel safely. You could not work openly. You became a hunted person in a world that remembered faces. There was also the psychological weight. Medieval people believed deeply in sin and divine judgment. Killing was not abstract. It carried eternal consequences in the minds of many. Confession could not always erase what you had done, especially if the killing was done for money. You might carry guilt, fear, and superstition with you, constantly wondering if illness, bad luck, or dreams were signs of punishment. Some assassins tried to justify their work by convincing themselves the target deserved it. Others drank heavily. Alcohol was common and strong, and it dulled the waiting and the memories. But it also slowed reflexes and increased mistakes. Many botched assassinations ended with the attacker dead instead of the intended victim. You were also expendable. Employers rarely cared about your survival. If you were captured, you were a liability. No rescue would come. No ransom would be paid. You knew this going in. That knowledge shaped every decision and made trust impossible. Every meeting could be a trap. Every payment could be delayed or denied. Violence surrounded you even when you were not using it. And yet, people continued to take these risks. The medieval world was harsh and uneven. Law favored the powerful. Revenge was often personal. Quiet removal seemed easier than open conflict. Assassins existed because the system created them, not because it admired them. As you sit quietly listening, you can imagine the long nights, the cramped hiding places, the constant awareness that one mistake meant public death and forgotten remains. You can imagine how little glory there was, and how much fear replaced it. And you may begin to wonder what kinds of people were most often targeted, and why certain killings mattered more than others in shaping medieval politics and power, which leads to a deeper question waiting in the shadows ahead. If you survived long enough to take more than one job, the nature of your targets shaped the rest of your life. Medieval assassins were rarely sent after kings or queens despite popular imagination. Such figures were too protected, too visible, and too politically dangerous to remove quietly. Instead, you were more likely to be sent after minor nobles, rival merchants, clergy members, or local officials whose deaths could be explained away as accidents, illness, or divine judgment. These targets lived close to other people. They shared walls, streets, and courtyards with neighbors, servants, and family. Privacy was rare. Bedrooms were shared. Doors were thin. Windows were open to air and sound. This meant that killing required proximity and timing rather than force. You had to know routines, meals, prayer hours, bathing habits, and who slept nearby. Information was everything, and gathering it was slow. You often relied on gossip. Tavern conversations, market chatter, servants' complaints. Medieval communities talked constantly. People knew who argued with whom, who owed money, who feared betrayal, but gossip was unreliable, and sometimes dangerous. Asking the wrong question too often could make you memorable. Being remembered was the enemy of survival. Some assassins posed as laborers or pilgrims. These were common figures who moved frequently and attracted little attention. Pilgrims in particular were useful disguises. They traveled alone, carried few possessions, and were expected to move on quickly. But pilgrim clothing also marked you as poor and vulnerable. You could be robbed, attacked, or turned away from lodging. Hunger and exhaustion were constant companions. The act itself was usually crude. Knives were favored because they were quiet and common. A knife wound could be explained as a robbery or personal dispute. Strangulation was also used but required strength and proximity, and left marks that raised questions. Poison was rare and risky. Dosages were uncertain, and symptoms could be slow, drawing suspicion back toward the person who provided food or drink. Many assassinations failed simply because the human body is unpredictable. People woke up, fought back, screamed, or survived wounds that should have been fatal. A single cry could bring help. A stumble could turn attacker into victim. There were no second chances. If you failed once, the city remembered. After the killing came the hardest part, leaving. Blood had a smell that lingered. Clothing had to be changed or discarded. Weapons needed to be hidden or thrown away. You could not run openly without drawing attention. Walking calmly required control, even as your heart raced. Guards questioned strangers more closely after any violent death. If caught nearby, your chances were poor. Medieval justice relied heavily on confession and witnesses. Torture was accepted as a method to extract truth. You knew this, and the knowledge followed you always. Some assassins carried poisons for themselves to avoid capture. Others accepted their fate, believing endurance might spare them the worst pain. Neither option was comforting. The consequences extended beyond your own life. If your identity became known, your family could suffer. Collective punishment was common. Relatives might be fined, expelled, or imprisoned. Villages associated with criminals could be taxed or watched. This meant that many assassins severed ties with their past completely. They became people without roots, drifting between towns, never staying long enough to be known. Payment was another source of anxiety. There were no contracts, only promises. Coin could be clipped, counterfeit, or withheld entirely. Employers sometimes claimed the job was botched or unnecessary after the fact. Disputes could not be settled publicly. Violence was the only leverage, and that rarely ended well. Some assassins attempted to build reputations, hoping fear would secure better treatment. This strategy backfired often. Authorities focused their efforts on known killers. Bounties were posted, informants were rewarded. Even criminals avoided you because your presence attracted danger. Religion complicated everything. Medieval Europe was deeply religious, and the church condemned murder unequivocally. Confession offered spiritual relief, but could also expose you if spoken to the wrong priest. Some clergy cooperated with authorities. Others demanded penance that was impossible to fulfill. Living with unresolved sin weighed heavily on many. Sleep was difficult. Dreams replayed moments of violence. Every knock at the door felt like an arrest. Idleness was interpreted as punishment. There was no separation between physical and moral consequences. Your body and soul were equally at risk. And yet, despite all this, assassination remained part of medieval power struggles. Quiet deaths altered successions, trade routes, and alliances. Small acts of violence rippled outward, shaping events far beyond the alley or room where they occurred. You were a tool, not a hero, and tools are discarded when they become inconvenient. As you reflect on this quiet, miserable existence, you might wonder how rulers and institutions responded to this constant threat, and what measures they took to protect themselves and how those defenses changed the daily lives of everyone else in the medieval world. By the time you reached the later part of your short and uncertain career, the world around you had already adapted to your existence. Medieval societies did not ignore assassination. They feared it quietly and built systems to reduce its chances. These systems shaped daily life, not only for killers, but for everyone else. And they ensured that even when you were not actively working, you were never truly at rest. Rulers responded first. Noble households reorganized space and routine to limit access. Private rooms became fewer. Meals were shared publicly. Trusted tasters, servants, and guards were placed between power and food. Doors were reinforced, locks improved, and sleeping arrangements adjusted so that no one important slept alone. These changes were meant to prevent poisoning or surprise attacks, but they also reduced privacy and increased constant observation. Travel became more controlled. Important figures moved with entourages even on short journeys. Routes were planned carefully, and stops were vetted in advance. Inns were inspected, and hosts questioned. This made your job nearly impossible if your target traveled frequently. It also made movement harder for ordinary people who faced delays, suspicion, and questioning simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Cities increased patrols, especially at night. Watchmen walked the streets carrying lanterns and weapons. Gates closed earlier and opened later. Curfews were enforced during times of unrest. These measures were meant to protect, but they also created tension. Being outside after dark without explanation invited punishment. For someone like you whose work relied on darkness, this meant greater risk and fewer opportunities. Information networks expanded. Authorities encouraged neighbors to report unusual behavior. Rewards were offered for tips. Confessionals were monitored informally. Markets, taverns, and inns became spaces of observation. People learned to watch each other not out of malice, but out of fear. This eroded trust and made anonymity difficult. Legal codes evolved to address secret killing. Penalties became harsher. Collective punishment became more common. The goal was deterrence, not justice. By making consequences unbearable, rulers hoped to eliminate the practice entirely. Instead, they pushed it further underground, increasing paranoia on all sides. You felt this pressure constantly. Even when not working, you had to behave carefully. Your movements, your speech, your companions all mattered. A careless joke or visible scar could mark you. You avoided deep friendships because attachment created vulnerability. Isolation became a survival strategy, but it also hollowed life. Eventually, most medieval assassins met one of three ends. Some were caught and executed publicly, their deaths serving as warnings. Others died quietly from illness, injury, or violence unrelated to their work, their past unrecorded and unmourned. A few disappeared entirely, blending into other lives as laborers, soldiers, or beggars carrying memories they never spoke aloud. There were no monuments for you. No songs preserved your name. Chronicles mentioned assassinations, but rarely the people who carried them out. You existed in the margins, footnotes of political change, unnamed and expendable. History remembered the result, not the cost. Yet your actions mattered. A single death could alter succession, spark conflict, or prevent it, shift alliances, or delay wars. The quiet violence you performed shaped outcomes far beyond your control. And because it was hidden, it was easier for societies to forget the human price. Looking back from the present, it is tempting to romanticize stealth and danger, but the medieval assassin lived a life defined by discomfort, fear, and erasure. There was no freedom, only constant calculation, no honor, only survival, and no legacy except absence. As you rest with this story, you might consider how modern societies still rely on hidden violence, how anonymity and expendability persist in different forms, and whether progress has truly removed the need for people to live and die in the shadows for causes they do not control. When you imagine the power of the Roman Empire, you may picture legions marching roads stretching across continents and emperors issuing commands from marble halls. But none of that worked without money. Gold, silver, grain, livestock, and labor flowed constantly toward Rome and the provinces that fed it. And standing between ordinary people and that endless demand was you, the Roman tax collector, a figure so disliked that hatred followed you everywhere you went. If you took this job, your problems began immediately. Taxes in the Roman world were not collected gently or invisibly. They were personal, physical, and unavoidable. People knew exactly who took their money because it was you. You stood in front of them with records, weights, measures, and soldiers nearby. You were the face of imperial pressure, and everyone knew it. You were not usually a noble. Most tax collectors came from the equestrian class or lower. Some were freedmen, former slaves trying to build wealth and security. Others were local elites attempting to gain favor with Roman authorities. Whatever your background, your position placed you between two forces that both distrusted you. The empire demanded results, and the people resented your presence. Roman taxation was complex and varied by region. There were land taxes, poll taxes, customs duties, inheritance taxes, and extraordinary levies during war or crisis. Rates could change suddenly. Records were imperfect. Census lists were outdated. You were expected to collect based on estimates, often unfair ones. If the numbers came up short, you were held responsible. This was the core misery of your job. Rome did not care how you got the money, only that it arrived. If a village could not pay, you still owed the amount. This meant you were constantly pressured to extract more than was reasonable just to protect yourself. Leniency was dangerous. Compassion could ruin you. To cover this risk, many tax collectors demanded extra fees. Some inflated assessments. Others seized goods directly: grain, animals, tools, even clothing. These actions were legal enough to pass inspection, but cruel enough to earn hatred. Over time, the line between survival and exploitation blurred. You traveled constantly, often alone, or with minimal escort. Roads were long and dangerous. Bandits targeted tax collectors specifically because they carried coin and were unpopular. Locals rarely helped you. Inns overcharged or refused service. Villagers delayed meetings, lied about assets, or hid property when they heard you were coming. Violence was always a possibility. Stones thrown from a distance. Dogs set loose. Threats whispered in markets. In some provinces, tax collectors were beaten or killed quietly, and the community closed ranks to protect itself. Rome responded with punishment, but distance made enforcement slow. You lived knowing help was far away. Your social life collapsed quickly. You were unwelcome at gatherings. Neighbors avoided you. Marriage prospects suffered. Families feared association with you. Might bring scrutiny or retaliation. Even your relatives felt the strain as resentment followed your name. Religion offered little comfort. While Roman religion emphasized duty and order, it also valued harmony. Tax collectors disrupted that harmony. In later centuries, Christian communities openly condemned them, associating their work with greed and moral corruption. Repentance required restitution, which was often impossible. Stress took a physical toll. Long journeys, poor food, constant anxiety, and lack of rest weakened the body. Illness was common. Medical care was expensive and unreliable. If you fell sick, collections stopped, but obligations did not. Debt accumulated silently. And yet, people kept taking this job. The pay could be substantial if you survived. Some collectors became wealthy. A few climbed socially, gaining land influence and citizenship privileges. These success stories were rare, but visible enough to tempt others. As you listen, you can imagine the constant tension, the closed doors, the forced smiles, the careful calculations at night, wondering if tomorrow would bring enough coin, or another complaint, another threat, another step closer to ruin. And you may begin to wonder how this system functioned for centuries, despite such misery, and what happened when the pressure finally became too great for both collectors and communities to bear. Once you had spent enough time on the road collecting for Rome, you learned a difficult truth. The system was not designed for fairness or stability. It was designed for extraction. Everything else, including your safety, reputation, and conscience, was secondary. To survive, you had to adapt, not by improving the system, but by bending yourself around its sharp edges. The structure that governed your work encouraged abuse, even if you tried to remain honest. In many provinces, taxes were farmed out. Wealthy individuals or companies paid the state up front for the right to collect taxes in a region. Once they secured that right, they were free to collect as much as possible. Any surplus was profit. Any shortfall was personal loss. You were either the farmer yourself or employed by one. In both cases, pressure flowed downward relentlessly. This meant your ledger ruled your life. Every visit, every assessment, every seizure was recorded carefully, not for justice, but for accounting. Numbers mattered more than people. If a village produced less than expected, the reason did not matter. Drought, illness, war, migration. None of it changed the total owed. You carried that burden from place to place, knowing that mercy would not be repaid. To manage this, you developed strategies. You learned which communities could be squeezed, and which would resist violently. You timed visits to avoid festivals, funerals, and harvests when tempers were short. You used local intermediaries, men who knew the people and could persuade, threaten, or negotiate on your behalf. These men were often disliked even more than you, because they were seen as traitors. Corruption became normal. Gifts were offered quietly to reduce assessments. Favored households were spared in exchange for loyalty or future favors. Enemies were punished through aggressive valuation. Over time, these practices hardened into routine. Even those who entered the role with principles found themselves compromising simply to stay afloat. Rome pretended to disapprove of corruption, but relied on it. Investigations occurred occasionally, usually when complaints reached dangerous levels or when political rivals sought advantage. When this happened, you were vulnerable. Records could be examined, witnesses questioned, and suddenly your survival tactics were redefined as crimes. Scapegoats were useful. High-level officials escaped scrutiny, while collectors like you absorbed the consequences. Fear shaped your relationships. You trusted few people. Assistants might steal or inform. Locals might lie convincingly. Superiors might abandon you if numbers disappointed. Every interaction carried risk. Even success was dangerous. Because wealth attracted envy and attention, your home, if you had one, was rarely peaceful. Tax collectors often lived in guarded houses or compounds. Walls and locks were common. Weapons were kept close. You slept lightly, listening for movement. Servants were vetted carefully. Even then, theft and betrayal occurred. Family life suffered deeply. Children were mocked or excluded. Spouses faced hostility in markets and public spaces. Some families moved frequently to escape reputation, but names followed. Letters from home carried stories of insults, threats, and isolation. Mental strain accumulated slowly. You replayed confrontations in your mind, wondering if a decision had pushed someone toward starvation or revolt. Some collectors hardened, emotionally detaching from consequences. Others became anxious, irritable, and withdrawn. Alcohol again was common. So was denial. At a broader level, resentment grew. Communities remembered names. Stories spread of cruelty and injustice. These memories fueled resistance when opportunity arose. Tax collectors were often the first targets during unrest, because they symbolized oppression more clearly than distant governors or emperors. You might hear whispers of rebellion as you traveled. Complaints grew louder. Payments arrived later. Excuses multiplied. You sensed tension but could not reduce demands without risking your own ruin. You were trapped between an empire that would not relent and people who could not endure much more. Eventually, something had to give. In some regions, reforms were attempted. Rates were adjusted, systems reorganized, oversight increased. These changes came slowly and unevenly. In the meantime, you continued walking dusty roads, carrying the weight of Rome in your satchel and the anger of its subjects in your path. As this pressure built, you may wonder what happened when the system finally cracked, when resentment turned into open resistance, and how tax collectors like you fared when order collapsed and the numbers on the ledger no longer mattered. When the strain finally broke, it rarely did so gently. For a Roman tax collector, the moment of collapse was not announced by official decree or orderly reform. It arrived as silence, where payments should have been threats, where cooperation once existed, and sudden violence that moved faster than any message to Rome. By the time authorities realized something was wrong, you were already in danger. Periods of unrest made your position almost impossible. During revolts, invasions, or civil wars, tax collectors were stripped of protection. Soldiers deserted to defend their own families. Local elites switched loyalties. Imperial orders lost authority. In these moments, you were exposed. People remembered every seizure, every insult, every extra coin demanded. Retribution was personal. In some regions, tax collectors were killed immediately when rebellion began. Records from Gaul, Judea, and parts of North Africa describe collectors hunted down by mobs or executed publicly as symbols of liberation. Their deaths were meant to erase imperial control as much as punish individuals. There was no trial, only memory and anger. Those who escaped faced ruin of a different kind. Without imperial backing, you could not enforce collection, and without collection, you could not repay obligations. Debts followed you. Property was seized. Former allies denied knowing you. Rome, when it reasserted control, often blamed collectors for failures rather than acknowledging systemic collapse. Careers ended quietly in disgrace. Even during peaceful transitions, reforms often arrived too late for you. Diocletian, and later emperors, attempted to reorganize taxation, making it more regular and predictable. But implementation was uneven, and enforcement harsh. Collectors were bound more tightly to their roles, held responsible for shortfalls regardless of cause. The job became hereditary in some cases, trapping families in generations of resentment. Your legacy lingered. Long after Rome faded, stories of cruel collectors remained in folklore and religious texts. In Christian writings, tax collectors became moral examples of greed and redemption because they were familiar figures of injustice. Their historical complexity disappeared, replaced by simplified condemnation. Yet the empire could not function without them. Roads, armies, administration, and cities depended on revenue. The system survived by sacrificing individuals. You were both necessary and despised. That contradiction defined your existence. As centuries passed and Rome transformed into memory, the role of tax collector changed, but the resentment endured. New states adopted similar systems and faced similar tensions. The lesson was never fully learned. Extraction without trust breeds instability, and those tasked with enforcing it bear the cost. As you rest with this story, you might reflect on how modern systems still place individuals between institutions and communities. How visible enforcement attracts blame and how history quietly repeats patterns under new names and technologies. If you were a medieval midwife, your work began before sunrise and often ended long after nightfall. You did not carry prestige or protection, yet you held lives in your hands more often than almost anyone else in your community. Birth was common, but safety was not. Every delivery was a risk, and every risk carried consequences that followed you long after the blood was washed away. You became a midwife, not through formal education, but through observation and necessity. Older women taught you what they knew. You learned by watching births, by listening to screams and prayers, by noticing which methods seemed to help and which failed. Knowledge passed quietly from woman to woman, often without written record. This made your skill invisible to authorities and easy to dismiss. Your tools were simple: clean cloths, if available, warm water, herbs, oils, and your hands. There was no understanding of infection as a cause of death. When mothers fell ill, afterward, it was blamed on weakness, fate, or divine will. When infants did not survive, it was seen as tragedy, but someone still had to answer for it. That someone was often you. You were expected to arrive quickly, regardless of weather or hour. You walked muddy roads in the dark, carrying what little you owned. If you were late, blame followed. If you arrived early, you waited, sometimes for hours in cramped, smoky rooms. Families watched you closely, measuring every action against fear. Childbirth was a community event. Women gathered to support the laboring mother. Men were excluded, but their expectations loomed nearby. Success brought relief, but failure brought suspicion. If a mother died, her family grieved and searched for cause. If an infant was stillborn, whispers began almost immediately. Religion shaped everything. Birth was seen as both sacred and dangerous. Women were believed to be spiritually vulnerable during labor. You were expected to guide prayers, ensure proper rituals, and sometimes baptize infants who seemed unlikely to live. A mistake here was not only medical but spiritual. This responsibility carried legal risk. Midwives were often questioned by church authorities. You might be called to testify whether an infant was born alive, whether a baptism occurred, whether a mother confessed sins before death. Your words mattered and could condemn or absolve others. That power was dangerous. In some regions, midwives were required to swear oaths, promising to report suspected infanticide or moral transgressions. This placed you between loyalty to women and obedience to authority. Refusal meant punishment. Compliance meant betrayal. Either choice carried long-term consequences. Fear surrounded abnormal births. If a child was born with deformities, blame often turned outward. Superstition filled gaps in understanding. Accusations of witchcraft were not constant, but they were possible, especially during times of famine, plague, or social tension. Your familiarity with herbs and the female body made you suspect in the eyes of some. Payment was uncertain. Some families paid in coin, others in food, cloth, or favors. Poor households might offer nothing at all. You could not easily refuse because word traveled fast. A midwife known to deny help risked isolation, yet generosity left you exhausted and impoverished. Your own health suffered. Repeated exposure to blood, bodily fluids, and exhaustion weakened you. Childbirth injuries were common, even among attendants. Back pain, joint damage, and chronic illness followed years of work. There was no retirement. You worked until you could not. Despite this, you were essential. Communities depended on you. Mothers trusted you more than distant male physicians who rarely attended births. You shared knowledge, quietly, advice about pregnancy, fertility, and survival. This made you respected and resented at the same time. As you listen, you can imagine the weight of expectation, the silence after a difficult birth, the moment when joy or grief settled, and all eyes turned toward you. You may begin to sense how thin the line was between valued healer and blamed outcast, and how quickly circumstances could shift, leaving you wondering how long trust could last before fear demanded someone to blame. As years passed, and you continued your work, you discovered that experience did not always bring safety. In many cases, it did the opposite. The more births you attended, the more you were known, and the more you were watched. Familiarity created reliance, but it also created scrutiny. Every success raised expectations. Every failure stood out more sharply. Your knowledge grew through repetition, not theory. You learned how long labor usually lasted, and when something felt wrong, you learned how to turn a child gently when the body allowed it, and when to stop before causing harm. You learned which herbs eased pain, which slowed bleeding, and which calmed panic. None of this knowledge was standardized. It lived only in memory and practice that made it powerful and fragile. Because your learning was informal, it was easy for others to dismiss it. Male physicians trained in universities began to appear in larger towns. They studied ancient texts written by men who had never attended a birth. Still, their education gave them status. When outcomes were good, they received credit. When outcomes were bad, blame often shifted back to you. This imbalance created quiet resentment. You were expected to follow instructions from men who arrived late or not at all. In emergencies, you acted alone, yet responsibility was shared unevenly. If a physician contradicted you publicly, your authority diminished even if your judgment was sound. Church authorities watched closely as well. Midwives occupied a strange position within religious life. You were allowed into intimate moments forbidden to priests. You heard confessions spoken in fear and pain. You sometimes performed emergency baptisms. This closeness to spiritual thresholds made you useful and suspicious. In some regions, inquisitors questioned midwives regularly. You might be asked about women who gave birth alone, children who died quickly, or pregnancies that seemed hidden. These questions were framed as concern, but carried threat. A careless answer could implicate you or someone else. Silence could be interpreted as guilt. The pressure intensified during crises. Famine, plague, and war increased infant mortality and maternal death. Communities searched for explanations. When suffering felt random, people looked for patterns and causes. Midwives became convenient figures because you were present at many tragedies. Rumors formed slowly. Someone remembered an herb you used. Someone else recalled a comment taken out of context. Over time, a narrative emerged that you knew too much or controlled outcomes unnaturally. These stories rarely began with accusation. They began with unease. You noticed changes in behavior. Conversations stopped when you entered a room. Payment was delayed. Requests became cautious. Trust thinned. Even families you had served faithfully grew distant. Fear spread quietly without confrontation. Legal protection was minimal. If accused, you depended on reputation and community support. But support weakened as suspicion grew. Trials did not require strong evidence. Testimony and belief mattered more. Your tools and herbs could be reinterpreted as proof of wrongdoing. Many midwives adapted by limiting their practice. They avoided complicated births or refused cases already deemed dangerous. This protected them slightly, but increased risk for mothers. Others withdrew entirely, choosing obscurity over danger. Communities lost skilled care but felt safer emotionally. Those who continued learned to be careful with language and ritual. You prayed aloud. You followed visible customs strictly. You avoided experimental methods, even when they might help. Survival required conformity, not innovation. Emotionally, the work became heavier. Each birth carried not only concern for mother and child, but fear for yourself. Success brought relief. Failure brought dread. Sleep was restless. Dreams replayed accusations imagined or real. Still, women sought you out. They trusted your presence, your calm, your experience. This trust mattered deeply. It reminded you why you began and why you endured, but it also placed you at the center of a fragile balance between necessity and fear. As you move through this section, you can sense how knowledge without protection becomes dangerous, and how communities under stress turn inward, seeking control. You may begin to wonder what happened when suspicion crossed into open accusation, and how a single bad outcome could unravel a lifetime of service. When suspicion finally turned into accusation, it rarely did so loudly at first. A midwife was not usually seized without warning. Instead, the pressure increased gradually, until resistance felt impossible. A question was asked in public. A comment was repeated. A visit from an official followed. By the time you realized what was happening, your position was already weak. Accusations often emerged after a cluster of misfortunes. A mother died during labor, an infant was stillborn, another child fell ill days later. Individually, these events were tragically common. Together, they felt meaningful to people searching for explanation. Fear demanded order and blame offered relief. You were questioned about your actions in detail, why you used a certain herb, why you touched the child in a particular way, why you spoke certain words. Ordinary practices were reframed as suspicious behavior. Years of experience became evidence of unnatural knowledge. If formal charges followed, your chances depended entirely on community support. Neighbors who once relied on you might hesitate to defend you, fearing association. Silence replaced advocacy. Some spoke against you to protect themselves. The process did not require proof as you would understand it. Belief carried weight. Punishments varied by region and period. Some accused midwives were fined or banished. Others were imprisoned. In the worst cases, execution followed. These outcomes were not inevitable, but they were possible enough to shape behavior long before any trial occurred. Even without formal punishment, accusation alone could end your work. Reputation once damaged rarely recovered. Families chose other attendants or none at all. You became isolated. Knowledge that once sustained communities disappeared quietly. Many experienced midwives adapted by retreating into domestic life. They continued to advise privately without formal attendance. This reduced risk but limited impact. Skills accumulated over decades vanished with each death, unrecorded and unrecognized. The broader consequence was loss. Maternal and infant mortality did not improve. In some places it worsened. Male physicians did not replace midwives effectively, especially among the poor. The system traded experience for control and paid the price silently. Looking back, the tragedy is not only individual suffering, but the erasure of practical knowledge. Midwives understood bodies in ways few others did. Their insights were shaped by observation and care, not theory. When they were pushed out, that understanding faded. Yet their influence persisted indirectly. Practices survived in households passed quietly between women. Techniques endured under new names. Memory resisted authority, even when voices were silenced. As you rest with this story, you may reflect on how societies treat those who hold informal power and knowledge, and how fear can transform necessity into threat. The medieval midwife stood at the edge of life and death, offering care without protection. Her disappearance left a gap that history rarely acknowledges but never fully filled. If you were a Viking trader, your life was built on movement, but shaped by uncertainty. Unlike the raider of popular imagination, you did not arrive with fire and weapons alone. You arrived with scales, weights, bundles of goods, and a sharp awareness that every journey could end with loss rather than profit. Trade sustained the Viking world as much as violence, yet it offered far fewer stories and far more quiet danger. You did not trade from comfort. Most Viking traders were also sailors, farmers, and craftsmen, depending on the season. When fields slept under frost, you turned to the sea. When the sea became too dangerous, you returned to land. There was no single profession to fall back on. Survival required flexibility and endurance. Your ships were practical, not luxurious. They were built for speed and shallow waters, allowing river travel deep into foreign lands. This advantage came with risk. The same light construction that made travel possible also made storms terrifying. A sudden squall could snap a mast, tear a sail, or swamp the hull. There were no accurate forecasts, only experience and prayer. Every voyage began with calculation. You measured what you could carry against what you hoped to gain. Furs, amber, walrus, ivory, iron, weapons, glass beads, slaves, and cloth filled your cargo. Each item represented labor and expectation. If markets were closed, hostile, or already saturated, your investment vanished. Trade routes were long and exhausting. From Scandinavia you traveled south along coasts into the Frankish world, east through rivers toward Byzantium, or south across open seas to the British Isles. Each route carried its own dangers, including piracy, disease, language barriers, and shifting political borders. You relied on hospitality, but could not trust it fully. A port that welcomed you one year might reject you the next. Local rulers demanded tolls, bribes, or tribute. Refusal meant confiscation or violence. Compliance reduced profit, but ensured passage. Negotiation was constant and tense. Currency was unreliable. Coinage varied by region and purity. Silver was weighed, not counted. Scales and weights were essential tools, and also points of suspicion. Accusations of cheating were common, and could escalate quickly. A disagreement over a few grams of silver might end in bloodshed. Violence was never far away. Even when trading peacefully, you traveled armed. Your reputation mattered. Being seen as weak invited attack. Being seen as aggressive closed markets. You balanced intimidation with restraint, constantly adjusting your behavior to unfamiliar customs. Illness was a constant threat. Long voyages weakened bodies. Food spoiled. Water stagnated. Minor injuries became serious without care. If you fell ill far from home, you relied on strangers who might help or abandon you depending on mood and advantage. Loneliness marked your life. Months passed without family. Communication was slow and uncertain. You left without knowing if your home would still stand when you returned. Storms, famine, or conflict could erase everything you left behind while you were away. Women also traded, though their roles are less recorded. Some managed goods, negotiated prices, and maintained networks while men traveled. Others traveled themselves, especially within regional markets. Their risks were different, but no less real, including violence, exploitation, and isolation. Profit was unpredictable. One successful voyage could elevate your household for years. One failure could plunge you into debt and dependency. Social standing rose and fell with cargo holds and market moods. Stability was rare. Despite this, trade bound the Viking world together. It connected distant cultures, spread technology and ideas, and sustained communities that could not survive on farming alone. Yet the individuals who carried this burden lived lives of constant calculation and exposure. As you settle into this quiet account, you might find yourself imagining the long days at sea, the careful weighing of silver, the watchful eyes in foreign markets. And you might begin to wonder how these traders navigated trust and betrayal in lands where law did not protect them, and reputation was all they carried with them into the next uncertain harbor. By the second or third voyage, you began to understand that profit depended on far more than cargo and weather. You had to read people, anticipate intentions, and navigate cultural differences with precision. Each market encounter carried layers of danger. A misjudged word, a poorly timed offer, or a misunderstanding of local custom could cost you your goods, your coin, or your life. Negotiation was constant. You were rarely welcomed with open arms. Local merchants, rulers, and even other travelers watched you closely. Offers were tested, contracts were verbal or informal, and trust was earned slowly. You had to weigh politeness against assertiveness, conceal desperation, and project confidence even when your ship was battered or your crew sick. One false move could escalate into conflict. Sometimes your only recourse was to leave quickly, abandoning not only merchandise but your reputation. Cultural knowledge was essential. In some regions, gifts or bribes were expected. In others, they were seen as insults. Religious rituals mattered. Failing to recognize a local deity, misinterpreting a sacred custom, or ignoring taboos could provoke hostility. You learned through trial and error which traditions could be bent and which were inviolable. Every error carried risk, sometimes subtle, sometimes lethal. Piracy was an ever-present threat. Other traders, desperate sailors, or outright bandits viewed a laden Viking ship as opportunity. You had to maintain vigilance constantly. Scouts on the horizon, armed crew at the ready, and contingency plans for retreat or defense. Battles were rare but decisive. Losing a skirmish could mean death, enslavement, or permanent loss of goods. Disease shadowed you relentlessly. Long weeks aboard ship, poor nutrition, and close quarters made fevers, dysentery, and scurvy common. A sick crew slowed travel, increased hostility from locals, and reduced the value of your goods. If an epidemic struck in a foreign town, markets might close, ships be quarantined, or port authorities refuse entry. Illness could erase months of careful planning in days. Debt shaped decision-making. Many traders borrowed heavily to fund voyages. Loans came from wealthy local merchants, nobles, or other Vikings. Repayment terms were harsh. Failure to deliver profit meant personal assets seized, ships confiscated, or legal claims pursued by foreign courts. Some debtors disappeared at sea, others returned home only to face public humiliation or imprisonment. The social cost was profound. Families were left behind for months or years. Letters traveled slowly, if at all. Children grew without your presence. Marriages were strained by absence and uncertainty. Friendships were temporary, and alliances depended on mutual survival rather than genuine trust. Companions might betray you if opportunity arose. Loyalty was conditional and fragile. Trust was the most fragile commodity. A local merchant might offer a profitable deal, but secretly plan to cheat you. Fellow Vikings might envy your cargo and attempt mutiny. Local authorities could demand bribes or levy fines unexpectedly. Every interaction carried potential betrayal. Learning whom to rely on required constant attention, careful observation, and often luck. The psychological strain was relentless. You calculated risks constantly, measuring lives, coin, and reputation. Sleep was light. Anxiety followed you even on calm waters. Nights brought nightmares of storms, pirates, and angry creditors. You learned to suppress fear, but it never disappeared entirely. A moment's distraction could be fatal. Despite this, Viking trade was indispensable. Markets thrived on your courage and endurance. Communities relied on the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies that your voyages made possible. Yet, individual survival depended less on skill than on fortune. One storm, one misjudged negotiation, or one outbreak of violence could erase months or years of effort. As you imagine this life, you may start to see the hidden toll of a system that seemed adventurous on the surface. Long ships carried more than goods. They carried stress, danger, and uncertainty. You might begin to wonder what happened when a trader arrived in a foreign town to find alliances had shifted, debts had multiplied, or natural disaster had destroyed months of carefully amassed cargo, leaving only choice, survive or vanish entirely. Eventually, no amount of skill or caution could fully protect you. The unpredictable forces of nature, human greed, and political change constantly threatened everything you had worked for. Storms destroyed ships, sudden raids emptied harbors, and rulers altered tolls or taxes without warning. Survival was never guaranteed, and your livelihood depended on balancing every decision against the possibility of total loss. Shipwrecks were among the greatest dangers. Even a sturdy longship could be torn apart by waves, hidden shoals, or shifting winds. Cargo, your crew, and sometimes your own life could vanish in minutes. When this happened, you had no insurance, no safety net, and often no legal recourse. You returned home with nothing, or you never returned at all. These losses were absorbed silently by the family and community, who depended on you, creating both grief and resentment. Hostile ports presented another recurring threat. Alliances between local rulers and other traders could shift suddenly. A friendly town one year could become inhospitable the next, and your familiarity with local laws or customs might no longer protect you. Conflict could escalate quickly. Merchants were robbed, boats impounded, or travelers detained indefinitely. The very networks you had relied on for survival were fragile, constantly tested by the pressures of scarcity, suspicion, and politics. Debt that had seemed manageable now became crushing. Loans taken to fund voyages became impossible to repay after losses at sea or in the markets. Creditors pursued you aggressively, sometimes across borders, claiming goods, homes, or even freedom. In some cases, failure to repay meant selling family members into servitude or fleeing entirely. Survival required not only skill but constant negotiation with both human and natural forces. The psychological burden only deepened. Years of vigilance, negotiation, and fear took a toll on your mind. Sleep became restless. Nightmares of storms, betrayal, and empty cargo holds haunted you. Every harbor visit demanded attention to countless variables: weather, markets, law enforcement, local customs, and potential enemies. Even in calm waters, your mind never rested. The margin between profit and ruin was razor-thin, and the slightest miscalculation could erase years of labor. Yet Viking traders persisted. Trade was essential for wealth, cultural exchange, and even survival of the communities they left behind. They delivered food, tools, textiles, metals, and rare goods to towns that depended on them. Despite danger, absence, and exhaustion, traders created connections across regions, contributing to the cohesion of the Viking world and beyond. Their work was invisible in many historical accounts, because it lacked the drama of raids or battles, but it shaped economies and societies profoundly. Those who survived for decades often adapted. They became cautious, traveling shorter distances, choosing reliable partners, and avoiding risky markets. Their ships were reinforced, their crews smaller but skilled. Knowledge of tides, winds, and social customs became second nature. Yet no adaptation fully eliminated uncertainty. The unpredictability of the world was a constant companion. Legacy was subtle. Unlike raiders, Viking traders rarely achieved fame. Their achievements were measured in stability, wealth accumulated, and networks established. Communities remembered them for reliability, not heroism. Yet through their quiet labor, these traders shaped economies, fostered cultural exchanges, and preserved survival in regions that might have otherwise stagnated. Their stories were largely erased from legend, replaced by the dramatic exploits of warriors and kings. As you reflect on their lives, it becomes clear that surviving as a Viking trader required endurance far beyond what is often celebrated in history. They managed danger, negotiation, and fatigue in a world with no guarantees. Theirs was a life where a single mistake could erase months of labor, where isolation and vigilance were constant, and where success was measured not by glory, but by mere survival. It forces you to consider how modern trade, finance, and logistics continue to rely on human resilience in ways that often go unnoticed, echoing the hidden struggles of those early navigators and negotiators. If you were a castle servant in the Middle Ages, your days were long, repetitive, and defined by the hierarchy around you. Castles were imposing, cold, and drafty places, designed to protect lords and their families, not to provide comfort for those who labored within them. As a servant, you moved constantly from dawn to dusk, performing tasks that ranged from cleaning and cooking to carrying messages and attending to personal needs, all under constant scrutiny. Most castle servants came from the surrounding countryside. You were rarely educated, rarely respected, and always replaceable. Some were bound to the household through obligations like serfdom, while others worked for wages that were barely enough to survive. Either way, your value was measured by your endurance and obedience, not skill or creativity. Daily routines were exhausting. Kitchens demanded the most labor. You chopped wood, tended fires, prepared enormous quantities of food, and cleaned greasy pots that never seemed to dry. You carried water from wells or cisterns, sometimes for miles. Laundry had to be washed by hand, dried, and ironed if possible, all while avoiding the wrath of the kitchen steward or the lord's family for any perceived sloppiness. Sleeping arrangements were minimal. Servants often shared crowded dormitories with poor ventilation and uncomfortable bedding. Cold winters meant shivering under thin blankets, while summer heat could be suffocating. Disease spread quickly in these close quarters. Illness could slow your work, but neglecting duties risked punishment. Hierarchies within service were rigid. Higher-ranking servants supervised lower-ranking ones, assigning tasks and meting out discipline. Complaints or disputes were handled internally, often harshly. Punishment for mistakes included extra labor, physical reprimands, or public humiliation. The system left little room for appeal. You were always being watched. Castle life demanded constant adaptability. Lords and ladies had unpredictable schedules. A sudden banquet, inspection, or military muster could disrupt your carefully planned day. Guests from distant lands might arrive with special demands or strange customs. You had to accommodate them while keeping up with your regular work, often sacrificing rest and nourishment. Danger was subtle but persistent. Open flames from torches and hearths caused frequent burns. Sharp knives and heavy cookware led to injuries. Roof tiles, stairs, and slippery floors were hazards that could result in broken limbs. If you fell ill or were injured, work rarely ceased. You were expected to continue despite pain, sometimes with the aid of fellow servants or minimal medical care. Your social life existed almost entirely within the castle walls. Outside interaction was limited. Letters to family took weeks, and travel was restricted. Some servants formed close bonds with others, but trust was fragile. Any gossip or perceived betrayal could lead to punishment or reassignment to the harshest tasks. Seasons dictated work intensity. Harvest time, hunting season, and preparation for winter required additional labor. Snow, rain, and mud increased the difficulty of transporting goods, tending livestock, and maintaining fortifications. The castle itself demanded constant upkeep. Walls, gates, and towers required cleaning and minor repairs that were dangerous and unending. Even minor errors had consequences. Spilled wine, undercooked meals, mislaid keys, or forgotten messages could result in scolding, whipping, or reassignment to harsher duties. Your life was defined by constant vigilance and incremental survival, and your reward for diligence was usually only the avoidance of punishment rather than recognition. Psychologically, castle service was draining. You witnessed the privileges of the nobility, the ease of their lives, and the lavishness of their celebrations, all while laboring endlessly in discomfort and risk. Feelings of resentment, fatigue, and isolation were common, yet speaking out could result in reprisal. Silence and endurance became necessary survival skills. Despite these hardships, castles relied on you completely. Without servants, meals would not appear, fires would die, and orders would not be carried out. Your labor was the invisible backbone of feudal life, yet you were expendable. a drop in the massive structure of stone and hierarchy. If you left, another laborer could replace you quickly. As you consider this life behind stone walls, you may start to imagine the endless repetition of chores, the weight of heavy water buckets, the cold draft of tower corridors, and the constant awareness that one mistake could undo hours of labor. It invites a deeper question: how did such relentless toil shape the minds and bodies of those who spent decades in service, and what strategies did they use to endure the invisible pressures of castle life? As you moved deeper into your role within the castle, you discovered that survival was as much about navigating human relationships as it was about completing labor. Castles were not just stone structures, they were microcosms of power, where every gesture, word, or mistake could shift favor or provoke punishment. Understanding this social architecture was essential, but learning it often came at great cost. Servants were constantly under surveillance. The lord and lady observed not only your work but your comportment. Stewards, chamberlains, and senior servants reported infractions, often exaggerating minor missteps to display loyalty or curry favor. A dropped tray, a misplaced garment, or even a moment of fatigue could be interpreted as negligence or disrespect. You quickly learned that diligence alone did not guarantee safety. Perception was equally critical. Favor determined access and risk. Those who gained the trust of the nobility or high-ranking servants might be assigned safer, more comfortable tasks, better quarters, or lighter loads. Conversely, disfavor often meant the hardest labor, hauling firewood in winter, cleaning latrines, or enduring long hours in poorly ventilated kitchens. Favor was precarious, fleeting, and often arbitrary, tied to mood rather than merit. Jealousy among servants added another layer of danger. Promotion, recognition, or the smallest sign of competence could provoke sabotage, gossip, or whispered accusations. You might find your tools missing, your work sabotaged, or your assignments made deliberately more difficult. These tensions created a constant undercurrent of vigilance, forcing you to navigate alliances carefully while avoiding overexposure. Daily life was also dictated by hierarchy and protocol. Certain areas of the castle were strictly off-limits unless summoned. Access to the lord's chambers, the pantry, or even specific stairways required permission. Missteps, entering without notice, lingering too long, or speaking out of turn, could result in punishment or social isolation. The castle's layout itself reinforced surveillance. Narrow corridors, open halls, and staircases designed for observation ensured that you were almost always visible. Seasons and festivals introduced additional stress. Banquets and religious celebrations required hours of preparation, meticulous attention to detail, and endurance of exhausting labor. Mistakes were magnified because nobles and visiting dignitaries were present. A spilled cup of wine, or a minor error in preparation, could transform minor embarrassment into public reprimand. Even holidays, designed for enjoyment, became tests of skill, stamina, and loyalty. Health risks were ever present. Unsanitary conditions, close quarters, and physical strain contributed to disease and injury. Broken bones, burns, cuts, and illness were commonplace. Medical care was limited, and often more harmful than helpful. A simple infection could leave you debilitated. Yet absence from duty was dangerous. The expectation was to persevere, even at personal cost. Emotional strain compounded the physical. Watching the nobility enjoy comfort and luxury while you labored under extreme conditions fostered resentment and fatigue. Loyalty was complicated. You depended on your superiors for survival, yet their whims dictated every aspect of your life. Displeasure could mean punishment, reassignment, or dismissal. Trust was conditional and fragile. Some servants adapted by learning to read moods and anticipate needs before being asked. Others relied on humor, flattery, or discreet gossip to navigate social tension. Still, no strategy fully shielded you from misfortune. Survival required constant vigilance, adaptability, and a careful balancing of obedience and self-preservation. Even with all these pressures, the castle could be a place of relative stability. You knew your role, your tasks, and the rhythm of daily life. Yet that rhythm was fragile, dependent on the ever-changing desires of lords, seasonal demands, and interpersonal dynamics. A single disruption, a sudden illness in the family, a new steward, or the arrival of an outsider could throw your carefully managed life into chaos. As you imagine life in these stone halls, you may begin to feel the tension of invisible forces constantly pressing down: surveillance, hierarchy, favor, and fear. It invites reflection on how human endurance functions under relentless scrutiny and how strategies for survival, obedience, vigilance, subtle manipulation become essential tools for living in a world where comfort and security are rare commodities. Eventually, the realities of castle life converged into an unrelenting pressure that wore on every servant. Punishments, both formal and informal, were a constant shadow. Minor mistakes could lead to physical reprimands, lashes, strikes, or the heavy hand of a steward. Public shaming was common. Spilled wine, crooked arrangements, or missed tasks might be announced before peers, ensuring humiliation alongside labor. Even seemingly trivial errors could echo through the household, affecting assignments and relationships for weeks. Severe missteps carried higher consequences. Theft, perceived disloyalty, or disrespect toward the nobility could result in imprisonment within the castle dungeons, dismissal into poverty, or, in extreme cases, corporal punishment administered under law. These punishments were not always predictable. Rules were fluid, often based on mood, hierarchy, or political considerations, leaving servants in a constant state of uncertainty. The physical toll of decades of labor was relentless. Backs ached from hauling firewood and water. Hands were calloused and cracked from endless cleaning and preparation. Knees, hips, and joints were damaged by hours spent on stone floors or climbing towers. Illness spread rapidly in shared quarters, and injuries that might have been minor elsewhere could prove debilitating in the castle, where assistance was minimal and labor never ceased. Mental strain compounded the physical. Constant surveillance, unpredictability, and rigid hierarchies created a climate of fear and anxiety. Every glance from a steward, every whispered comment among peers, and every shift in the lord's attention carried potential consequences. The mind adapted by developing hypervigilance, but this came at the expense of rest, reflection, and peace of mind. Social bonds were both lifelines and potential liabilities. Friendships with other servants provided brief relief, shared understanding, and assistance in physically taxing tasks. Yet these bonds could also provoke jealousy, resentment, or betrayal. Alliances were fragile and shifting. Trust was a currency as precious as coin. A single rumor or misinterpreted act could turn confidants into adversaries, leaving you vulnerable. Your personal identity was often subsumed into the castle itself. Years of service blurred the boundary between work and life. Holidays, festivals, and seasons passed largely unnoticed unless tied to labor demands. Children grew without your guidance, family connections weakened, and the world outside the castle seemed distant and inaccessible. The life of a servant was measured in tasks completed, fires tended, and rooms cleaned rather than in personal milestones or achievements. Yet, despite invisibility, your labor was critical. Lords, ladies, soldiers, and guests relied entirely on the infrastructure you maintained. Meals, hygiene, messages, and order all depended on your presence and endurance. Without servants, the castle could not function, yet history rarely remembers you. Your contribution was essential but unrecorded, blending into the stone walls, polished floors, and empty corridors. Some servants endured decades, their resilience a quiet testament to human adaptability. Others perished early from accidents, illness, or sheer exhaustion. In every case, the personal cost was high: health, privacy, autonomy, and sometimes life itself. Success was survival, not recognition. The reward was simply another day of continued labor rather than reprieve or acknowledgement. Reflecting on this life invites a broader contemplation. How do systems of power depend on invisible labor? How do structures of hierarchy, surveillance, and expectation shape human endurance and resilience? The medieval castle, with its grandeur and authority, relied on countless unseen hands, and those hands bore the weight silently. You may leave this story thinking not of the nobility who lived in comfort, but of the servants whose sweat and vigilance allowed history to proceed unnoticed. If you were a medieval blacksmith, your life was defined by heat, noise, and relentless labor. You stood over the forge day after day, hammering red-hot iron into tools, weapons, and household implements. Your work was essential to communities, armies, and farms, yet it was punishing, repetitive, and often dangerous. Unlike nobles or clergy, your skill offered little protection from injury, illness, or social vulnerability. Most blacksmiths came from artisan families, or learned through apprenticeship. Learning was slow and required repeated exposure to harsh conditions. Young apprentices started with menial tasks, carrying coal, fetching water, cleaning bellows, Only after years of endurance and observation could they begin shaping iron themselves. Mastery was rarely guaranteed. Even a skilled smith could be undone by a simple miscalculation. The forge was both your workplace and your constant hazard. Temperatures reached hundreds of degrees. Sparks flew unpredictably, igniting clothing or igniting nearby materials. Smoke and fumes irritated eyes and lungs, and ventilation was minimal. Over time, respiratory issues were common, and some blacksmiths developed chronic lung problems that limited their longevity. Labor was continuous. Farmers, soldiers, and villagers all demanded tools, nails, plows, horseshoes, and weapons. Delays could ruin livelihoods elsewhere, and clients often blamed the smith for any shortcomings. You faced relentless pressure to produce quality work quickly, a demand complicated by the variable quality of raw iron or occasional shortages of fuel. Injury was a regular risk. Missed swings or slips could crush fingers or hands. Hot metal caused burns. Bellows, hammers, and anvils were heavy and unwieldy. You learned to work with precision, but fatigue eroded vigilance. Each mistake could mean weeks of incapacitation, or worse, permanent disability. Economic pressures were constant. Wages were modest. The wealth of a blacksmith depended on reputation, clientele, and regional demand. Competition was real. Other smiths or traveling craftsmen could undercut prices, leaving you dependent on repeat business. Debt was a possibility if you invested in more tools or fuel than you could afford. Seasons dictated workload. Harvest required extra plows and sickles. War required weapons and armor. Winter limited fuel availability and slowed production. You worked long days, often from sunrise to sunset, with little chance for leisure. Meals were brief and sustenance minimal, often eaten near the forge between tasks. Your social status was ambiguous. You were respected for skill but also considered part of the lower artisan class. You were necessary but expendable. Lords and guilds sometimes demanded loyalty, taxes, or quotas that left you little room for negotiation. A missed delivery could harm your social standing or provoke legal complaints. Noise, heat, and vibration compounded physical strain. Hammering for hours caused joint pain, back problems, and early-onset arthritis. Your hands, crucial tools themselves, grew thickened, scarred, and blistered. Long-term exposure to metal dust increased risk of chronic illness. Few medical remedies were effective, leaving you to endure pain while maintaining productivity. The work was isolating. Apprentices and assistants were few. Collaboration was minimal. Social interaction occurred mainly when clients arrived. Conversations often revolved around requests or complaints, leaving little space for camaraderie. Outside the forge, fatigue limited participation in village life or family events. Despite these challenges, blacksmiths were central to survival. Crops could not be harvested, horses could not be shod, and armies could not march without your labor. Yet recognition rarely matched contribution. Your name seldom appeared in records, unless scandal or failure drew attention. History remembered swords and armor, not the calloused hands and enduring backs that made them possible. As you imagine this life, you may begin to sense the relentless rhythm of hammer against anvil, the oppressive heat, the strain on body and mind, and the precarious balance between skill, survival, and social standing. You may also wonder what happened when mistakes, accidents, or changing economies disrupted a blacksmith's hard-earned stability, and how those pressures shaped the very fabric of medieval communities. By the second decade of your work as a blacksmith, you realized that survival depended as much on navigating social structures as on mastering metal. Apprenticeship was no longer simply a period of learning, it was also a trial in endurance, patience, and politics. Young apprentices were expected to obey orders unquestioningly, perform tedious tasks, and absorb knowledge through observation, often without explanation. Mistakes were punished, sometimes harshly, and the line between teaching and cruelty was thin. Guilds began to dominate your professional life. Membership offered benefits, access to workshops, trade networks, and legal protection, but it also imposed rules. Guilds dictated hours, standards of workmanship, pricing, and even the sources of raw materials. Deviating from guild expectations could lead to fines, expulsion, or ostracization. Your livelihood depended on strict adherence, yet guild decisions were often influenced by politics, favoritism, or rivalry. The pressure for perfection was relentless. A poorly forged sword could break in combat. A misaligned horseshoe could injure a horse, angering the owner and causing financial or legal consequences. Each piece you created carried not just material value but responsibility for someone else's safety, livelihood, or honor. The mental strain of constant vigilance against small errors was compounded by the physical exhaustion of long hours at the forge. Resources were never guaranteed. Iron might be low in purity, charcoal could be scarce, fuel costs could rise unexpectedly, you needed to adapt quickly, often improvising techniques or adjusting designs mid-production. Mistakes in these circumstances were inevitable, yet your reputation and livelihood hung in the balance. A single faulty batch could ruin a season's work. Economic instability added another layer of tension. Wars, famine, or epidemics could disrupt demand, leaving you with unsold goods or unpaid orders. You were often expected to deliver despite shortages or delays, absorbing the consequences yourself. Credit arrangements could strain relationships with clients, and debts were difficult to recover without risking conflict. Physical strain continued unabated. Chronic back pain, joint problems, and vision deterioration were common. Extended exposure to heat, smoke, and metal dust led to respiratory and skin issues. Some blacksmiths suffered partial loss of hearing from constant hammering or developed arthritis that limited mobility. Despite these ailments, work never ceased, because income and reputation depended on relentless production. The apprenticeship system also created social hierarchies within the forge. Journeymen could be impatient with novices. Masters could be authoritarian or indifferent. Collaboration was essential, but fraught with tension. You needed to manage not only your own labor, but also supervise, correct, and sometimes shield apprentices from mistakes that could reflect poorly on the workshop. Mismanagement could result in punishment from guilds or loss of patronage. Mistakes had consequences beyond reputation. Clients often had little patience for failure. Broken tools, poorly forged implements, or delayed deliveries could provoke legal disputes, physical confrontations, or fines imposed by local authorities. Even a minor error could escalate into a financial or social disaster, forcing you to compensate materially or endure public humiliation. Despite these hardships, blacksmithing offered a sense of indispensability. Villagers, farmers, and nobles relied on your work daily. Weapons, armor, and tools were central to survival and defense. Your labor supported not only your household, but the entire local economy. Yet the paradox remained. You were essential, yet vulnerable, skilled, yet expendable, respected for ability, yet often dismissed socially. As you contemplate this stage of your life, you may sense the tension between mastery and survival, the constant negotiation between guild rules, client demands, and physical limits. You may begin to wonder how long a blacksmith could endure these pressures before fatigue, injury, or economic instability upended a career built painstakingly over decades. Eventually, the cumulative strain of decades at the forge became unavoidable. Your body carried scars from burns, joint damage, and chronic back pain. Your lungs were thickened with soot. Your eyes blurred from smoke and sparks. Injuries that once seemed minor now lingered, and recovery was slow or impossible. Each day of labor reinforced wear and tear, leaving you increasingly vulnerable to mistakes that could endanger both your livelihood and those who depended on your work. Economic pressures persisted throughout your life. Wars, plagues, and famine disrupted demand. Clients delayed payment, markets fluctuated, and raw material shortages limited production. Even a highly skilled blacksmith could find a season of ruin. Creditors were unforgiving, and without proper guild support, you could lose tools, your workshop, or even your home. Survival required constant vigilance, shrewd negotiation, and sometimes compromise of quality to meet urgent demand. The mental toll was equally heavy. You carried not only physical exhaustion, but also responsibility for the safety and efficiency of your community. Tools, plows, armor, and weapons all bore the mark of your skill and the potential consequences of error. The knowledge that failure could harm others, combined with the relentless demands of the forge, created chronic stress and anxiety. Even moments of rest were haunted by memories of missed deadlines or imperfect work. Guilds offered some protection, but they could also amplify pressure. Disputes with masters or fellow smiths could escalate quickly. Complaints could result in fines, reassignment of work, or even exclusion from the trade entirely. Reputation was everything. A single accusation or poorly executed piece could tarnish decades of careful labor. Survival required not only skill at the anvil, but careful navigation of social and political landscapes within and outside the workshop. Despite hardships, your labor was vital. Farmers could not harvest without your tools. Armies could not march without your weapons. Horses could not work fields without your horseshoes. Communities depended on blacksmiths, Yet history rarely records your contribution. Your name seldom appeared in chronicles unless scandal or failure brought notoriety. Success was measured in quiet endurance rather than recognition. Some blacksmiths adapted by slowing their work, delegating more to apprentices, or specializing in less physically demanding tasks, as age and injury limited their strength. Others continued full labor despite pain, motivated by necessity, pride, or lack of alternatives. Each choice carried consequences. Reducing workload risked financial instability, while continuing at full pace risked permanent injury or death. The legacy of your work endured silently. Tools, nails, plows and weapons circulated long after you could no longer forge them. Your skill influenced generations of apprentices, spreading knowledge that shaped the productivity and defense of countless communities. Yet this impact was largely invisible, felt, relied upon and forgotten in equal measure. The labor that sustained societies was often taken for granted, leaving a quiet but enduring imprint on the structure of medieval life. As you reflect on this story, it becomes clear that the life of a blacksmith was defined by endurance, vigilance, and a constant negotiation between physical limitations, economic pressures, and social expectations. Their work was essential yet dangerous, respected yet vulnerable, and their contributions, though largely uncelebrated, formed the backbone of communities and economies. You may leave this section considering how modern labor systems continue to depend on invisible endurance, echoing the challenges faced by blacksmiths centuries ago. If you were a medieval scholar, your life was dominated by books, scrolls, and the relentless pursuit of knowledge in a world that valued learning selectively. Unlike modern scholars, you did not enjoy standardized education, libraries with comprehensive collections, or academic freedom. Instead, your world was fragmented, access to texts was limited, copying was laborious, and the very act of acquiring knowledge involved navigating social, financial, and religious obstacles. Most scholars were men attached to monasteries, cathedral schools, or the courts of nobles. Women were rarely admitted, except in rare convents. You were expected to read, transcribe, and sometimes teach, dedicating countless hours to study, copying manuscripts, and preserving knowledge. Mistakes were costly. A miscopied letter could alter meaning, propagate error, and reflect poorly on your reputation. Accuracy was demanded, yet perfection was nearly impossible. Material conditions were harsh. Writing required ink, parchment, and quills, all expensive and sometimes scarce. Candles or oil lamps provided insufficient light for long hours of study, straining your eyes. You worked in drafty, cold rooms during winter, or stifling heat in summer. Physical discomfort was constant. Posture, lighting, and repetitive motion caused back and neck pain, eye strain, and fatigue. Scholarship demanded patience. Copying a single manuscript could take months. Errors were nearly inevitable, and correcting them involved delicate effort to preserve the integrity of texts. You worked under strict supervision if attached to a monastic scriptorium, where elder monks or supervisors monitored your progress. Mistakes could lead to correction, censure, or assignment to more tedious tasks. Access to knowledge was limited by language and location. Latin dominated academic work, creating barriers for those without prior education. Greek and Arabic texts were available only through translations or rare manuscripts. Travel was necessary to consult foreign texts, but dangerous and expensive. Without mobility, your learning was confined, leaving you reliant on local copies and oral instruction, which were incomplete and sometimes inaccurate. Expectations were high and rewards low. You were expected to produce accurate copies, commentaries, and occasionally original treatises. Recognition was rare, limited to patrons, fellow scholars, or ecclesiastical authorities. Payment, if any, was modest. Many scholars depended on patronage from nobility or the church, leaving them vulnerable to changing favor or political tides. Loss of patronage could mean poverty, displacement, or an abrupt end to intellectual pursuits. Political and religious pressures were constant. Certain ideas were forbidden. Deviation from accepted doctrine could bring suspicion, censure, or even accusations of heresy. You had to navigate delicate boundaries, present ideas boldly enough to demonstrate competence, but carefully enough to avoid persecution. Intellectual freedom was constrained, creating a tense balance between curiosity and caution. Your daily rhythm was dictated by study, prayer, and copying. Hours blended together in monotony, punctuated only by meals or communal obligations. Sleep was often sacrificed in pursuit of deadlines, illuminated by flickering candlelight. The monotony was mentally taxing, The repetitive motion of writing, the constant scrutiny of texts, and the unending need for precision made mental exhaustion inevitable. Community among scholars was limited but meaningful. Correspondence and occasional visits offered intellectual engagement, but most learning was solitary. Rivalry and competition existed. Demonstrating skill could provoke jealousy. Knowledge was precious but isolating, a double-edged sword that elevated you in status yet reinforced separation from ordinary society. Despite hardship, your work mattered. Preserving and transmitting knowledge shaped generations. Religious texts, scientific treatises, and philosophical works survived because of your labor. Yet, recognition was rare. You were often anonymous. Your name lost to history even as your work endured. This invisibility, combined with relentless physical and mental strain, defined the scholar's existence. As you imagine this life, consider the monotony, the physical discomfort, the constant scrutiny, and the fragile nature of reputation and patronage. The pursuit of knowledge was a privilege, but also a burden, a life of quiet obsession with ideas that could bring influence or ruin, depending on timing, favor, and circumstance. You may begin to wonder how scholars endured these pressures, and what happened when their carefully copied knowledge clashed with political or religious authority. As your career progressed, you discovered that surviving as a medieval scholar depended as much on social navigation as on intellectual skill. Patronage dictated the course of your work. Nobles, bishops, or wealthy merchants provided resources, parchment, ink, access to rare manuscripts, but their support was conditional. Favor could be withdrawn at a moment's notice, leaving you without materials, income, or protection. Your livelihood depended on aligning your work with their interests, which often constrained creativity and limited inquiry. Patronage carried obligations. You might be expected to produce works that glorified your patron, chronicled their achievements, or defended their political position. Failure to deliver in a timely or satisfactory manner risked public censure, loss of support, or outright dismissal. The intellectual independence you craved was always balanced against the immediate need to appease those with power over your resources and status. Travel, while intellectually enriching, introduced constant risk. To consult distant manuscripts or meet with other scholars, you had to journey over poor roads, across rivers, and through territories controlled by potentially hostile lords or bandits. Illness, robbery, or political unrest could halt your work, delay your projects, or endanger life. Even a carefully planned expedition was subject to the whims of weather, politics, and chance. Competition among scholars intensified pressure. Manuscripts were few, and copying them demanded painstaking accuracy. A rival could seize credit, misrepresent your interpretations, or spread rumors about errors in your work. Scholarly reputation was fragile. One miscopied passage or controversial idea could ruin credibility, provoke ridicule, or attract the attention of inquisitors. The pursuit of knowledge was inseparable from the management of perception and reputation. Religious and political oversight further complicated your work. The church controlled access to texts, dictated acceptable interpretations, and monitored potential heresy. A misstep, a controversial commentary, an unconventional translation, or even an innocuous annotation could invite scrutiny. Censorship, reproof, or threats of excommunication were real dangers. Intellectual curiosity required caution, self-censorship, and constant vigilance. Economic realities intensified stress. Scholars often lived frugally, dependent on stipends, small fees for teaching, or occasional gifts. Supplies for study were costly, and mistakes in purchasing or preserving parchment, ink, or manuscripts could halt productivity for months. Debt was a frequent companion, forcing some scholars to take on menial tasks, tutoring, or copying additional texts to remain solvent. Even survival was contingent on careful planning and frugal management. The work itself was physically and mentally taxing. Extended periods of writing strained eyes, hands, and posture. Hours bent over manuscripts under dim candlelight caused fatigue and chronic pain. Mental exhaustion was equally oppressive. Tracking intricate theological, philosophical, or scientific arguments demanded intense concentration, often while under pressure from patrons, competitors, or religious authorities. Social isolation amplified the burden. While correspondence or occasional meetings with other scholars offered engagement, much of your life was spent alone with texts. Mistakes could go unnoticed or be exploited. Successes were often invisible beyond your immediate circle. Your intellectual labor shaped the world, but recognition was delayed, partial, or entirely absent. Yet, knowledge was power, though fragile and perilous. The works you preserved, annotated, and transmitted, formed the foundation for future generations. Scientific observations, philosophical treatises, and religious commentary survived in part because of your labor, but the cost was immense. Constant pressure to maintain accuracy, dependence on fragile patronage, risk from rivals, and the psychological strain of navigating a world that valued ideas selectively and sometimes lethally. As you reflect on this stage, you may sense the tension between intellectual ambition and survival. Knowledge was simultaneously a tool, a threat, and a lifeline. The scholar walked a narrow path, balancing curiosity against conformity, labor against reputation, and inquiry against danger. You may begin to wonder what happened when a controversial idea or political shift suddenly imperiled a scholar's carefully maintained life and work. Eventually, the life of a medieval scholar settled into a delicate balance of endurance, subtle influence, and constant vigilance. Years of painstaking copying, studying, and annotating manuscripts took their toll physically and mentally. Eyes strained from flickering candlelight, hands cramped from repetitive motion, and posture deteriorated from long hours bent over desks. The mind, though enriched by knowledge, was fatigued by the constant pressure to maintain accuracy, navigate patronage, and avoid religious or political censure. The risks never fully disappeared. Even a seasoned scholar faced the possibility of accusations of heresy, professional sabotage, or sudden loss of patronage. Libraries could be destroyed by fire or war, erasing years of labor in an instant. Manuscripts were fragile, and the misfortune of a single miscopied text could undermine credibility or perpetuate errors that might haunt generations. Survival required vigilance in both physical and intellectual realms. Despite the hardships, scholars left enduring legacies. Works preserved in monasteries, cathedral schools, and private collections formed the foundation of European intellectual life. Observations, commentaries, and translations bridged cultures, passing classical knowledge, scientific understanding, and religious thought to new generations. Yet recognition was rarely immediate. Your name might be absent from the manuscripts you painstakingly copied, your contribution known only to a few peers or patrons. The influence was profound but largely invisible, embedded in the continuity of knowledge rather than public acclaim. The interplay between intellectual labor and societal dependence was stark. Nobles, clergy, and the literate elite relied on your expertise, yet your security rested on their favor. Political upheaval or changing religious doctrine could abruptly shift circumstances. Scholars often endured displacement, poverty, or forced adaptation to new regimes or patrons. Intellectual survival was inseparable from social acumen and political awareness. Health and longevity were compromised by decades of sedentary yet demanding work. Respiratory issues from candle smoke and ink fumes, repetitive strain injuries, eye degeneration, and malnutrition were common. Yet many continued until physical decline limited productivity, driven by dedication, necessity, or fear of losing status. Life as a scholar demanded resilience and a willingness to endure hardship for the sake of knowledge, however unrecognized it might remain. Mentorship offered a quiet form of continuity. Teaching apprentices or younger students allowed knowledge to propagate beyond your immediate efforts. Through these relationships, ideas persisted, even as individual scholars faded into obscurity. Intellectual labor was cumulative, incremental, and often anonymous, but its effects resonated across time and space, quietly shaping society. As you reflect on this life, you may recognize a paradox. A scholar's existence was lonely, taxing, and precarious, yet it produced enduring influence that outlasted the scholar's body and reputation. Survival required negotiation, endurance, and adaptability, while impact remained largely unseen. The work was essential yet invisible, shaping the future silently. If you were a medieval messenger, your life was defined by speed, vigilance, and the constant threat of failure. You carried information, decrees, letters, and sensitive documents across kingdoms and principalities. Unlike modern couriers, you had no protected routes, no standardized roads, and no guarantee of safety. Your responsibility was absolute, messages were urgent, secrets vital, and delays could have severe consequences. Most messengers were employed by kings, nobles, or wealthy merchants. Some were mounted on horses, others traveled on foot depending on urgency, terrain, or resources. Your livelihood depended on endurance, navigational skill, and the ability to manage fatigue and danger. Unlike stationary laborers, your work demanded mobility across often hostile territory, with survival always hanging in the balance. Roads were treacherous. Paved routes existed in limited areas. Most paths were dirt tracks prone to flooding, mud and erosion. Rivers had to be crossed without bridges. Forests were dense and difficult to navigate, and mountains were slow and exhausting. Weather added unpredictability. Rain turned roads into quagmires, snow blocked passes, and storms endangered both you and your horse. Banditry and robbery were constant threats. Travelers were easy targets, and messengers often carried valuable information, money, or tokens that could attract thieves. You had to travel armed, remain alert, and sometimes evade ambushes. Even a minor delay or hesitation could allow attackers to overtake you. If captured, the consequences could range from theft and humiliation to imprisonment or death. Political instability added risk. Crossing the borders of rival lords or kingdoms required knowledge of local allegiances, tolls, and protocols. A messenger could be mistaken for a spy, detained or executed. Misreading customs, failing to pay required fees, or traveling at the wrong time could provoke lethal consequences. Your survival depended on vigilance, negotiation, and sometimes luck. Fatigue was constant. Long days of travel left little opportunity for rest. Meals were irregular and often meager. Shelter was uncertain. Inns were scarce, and staying with locals carried social and security risks. Exposure to the elements was unavoidable, and minor illness could quickly become debilitating if you were far from aid. Accuracy was non-negotiable. Messages had to be delivered precisely, word for word. Errors could provoke wars, miscommunications, or personal punishment. You carried the weight of diplomacy, commerce, and sometimes life-and-death decisions with each letter. Misremembering a phrase, misplacing a document, or misjudging a route could ruin a career or end it. Social isolation compounded hardship. Days and nights were spent alone on the road, save for the occasional companion or fellow traveler. Conversation was limited, and you became accustomed to solitude. Psychological strain included constant anxiety, hypervigilance, and the creeping fear of unknown dangers. The life of a messenger demanded mental resilience as much as physical stamina. Tools of the trade were simple but essential: sturdy boots, reliable horses, maps or knowledge of terrain, and sometimes weapons. Even a minor failure in equipment, a broken wheel, a tired horse, a dull blade, could result in serious delay or danger. Preparation was constant, and each journey carried the potential for unforeseen challenges. Despite the hardships, your role was indispensable. Kings, merchants, and communities relied on you to transmit information that shaped trade, war, and governance. Without your endurance, critical communication broke down, with consequences far beyond your personal life. Yet recognition was rare, and failure, no matter how slight, was remembered sharply. As you reflect on this life, imagine long hours on dusty roads, crossing forests and rivers, navigating danger and political complexity, all for messages that might change the fate of kingdoms. It invites contemplation. How did messengers endure constant uncertainty, and what happened when critical information was delayed, intercepted, or lost entirely? By the second stage of your career as a messenger, you realized that survival and success required more than endurance and speed. Every journey carried not just physical risk but intellectual and strategic challenges. You were responsible for sensitive information, letters, decrees, or intelligence that could alter political or military outcomes. Failure to deliver accurately or on time could provoke diplomatic crises, military disaster, or severe punishment. Secrecy was paramount. Messages were often written in codes, ciphers, or shorthand to prevent interception. You had to memorize details, protect documents from theft, and ensure that no unauthorized person gained access. A lapse in discretion could result in immediate execution or imprisonment, as rulers rarely tolerated breaches that threatened state or commerce. Your mental acuity had to match your physical stamina. Route planning was critical. Maps were crude, and terrain was often uncharted or changed with the seasons. You needed to anticipate natural obstacles, avoid known bandit territories, and plan stops for rest and resupply. Traveling at night or through dangerous regions was sometimes necessary to meet deadlines, further increasing the risk of injury or disorientation. Even a small error in navigation could add days to a journey or place you directly in harm's way. Political borders introduced additional hazards. Crossing into rival territories required understanding local law, customs, and alliances. Toll collection, bribes, or documentation could be demanded. Misjudging a border official's mood or underestimating regional tensions could lead to detention, interrogation, or even execution on suspicion of espionage. Your survival depended on diplomacy, observation, and rapid decision-making. Weather, disease, and fatigue compounded these risks. A sudden storm could wash out paths or river crossings, while extreme heat or cold threatened health and endurance. Illness, whether from contaminated water, spoiled food, or exhaustion, could delay delivery and jeopardize life. Despite preparation, factors outside your control could undermine weeks of careful planning. Rivalries and espionage made every journey potentially deadly. Other messengers, spies, or opportunistic individuals might seek to intercept your message. Verification of delivery was often impossible until arrival, leaving you constantly anxious about your route and cargo. Even within your own ranks, competition for favor or recognition could create tension and distrust. Physical challenges persisted. Long hours on horseback caused soreness, joint pain, and blisters. Traveling on foot through uneven terrain resulted in fatigue, sprains, and exposure to predators. Equipment failures, broken saddles, dull weapons, or worn boots could incapacitate you in hostile territory. Your body was as much a tool of your profession as your mind. Economic and social pressures were also significant. Messengers often received modest payment for high-risk work. Delays or mistakes could reduce compensation or provoke penalties. Social isolation meant your contributions were largely invisible. Your labor sustained kingdoms and merchants alike, yet recognition was rare and failure highly visible. Despite these burdens, your work remained vital. Wars, trade agreements, legal decisions, and personal correspondence depended on the timely and accurate delivery of your messages. Each successful journey reinforced stability, yet each misstep carried the potential for disaster. Your existence was a fragile balance of endurance, cunning, and perseverance. As you imagine this stage of life, you may feel the tension between relentless physical labor, mental vigilance, and the knowledge that a single misstep could alter the fate of a ruler, a community, or an entire region. It raises a question: how did medieval messengers endure repeated exposure to such peril while remaining precise and dependable? And what happened when a single journey failed catastrophically? Eventually, the life of a medieval messenger became a relentless rhythm of travel, vigilance, and endurance. Each journey demanded physical stamina, mental alertness, and unwavering focus. Your body bore the strain. Aching muscles, joint pain, blisters, and fatigue were constant companions. Horses, when available, could falter, tire, or succumb to injury, leaving you to traverse difficult terrain on foot. Each day presented hazards, from bandits and wild animals to treacherous rivers and unstable roads. The pressure to deliver accurately never diminished. Messages often determined political, military, or economic outcomes. A single error, a misread letter, a forgotten detail, or delayed arrival could provoke conflict, financial loss, or punishment. You carried responsibility that far exceeded your physical presence, making every journey an exercise in accountability, strategy, and risk management. Secrecy and discretion remained essential. Intercepted correspondence could have grave consequences: espionage, betrayal, or political fallout. You were constantly aware that every interaction, glance, or misstep could expose sensitive information. Even trusted intermediaries were potential vulnerabilities. Survival required a combination of cunning, observation, and swift judgment, qualities that were as important as speed or stamina. Fatigue and isolation compounded the danger. Days and nights spent traveling alone eroded morale, leaving little space for reflection, social interaction, or rest. The mind adapted to hypervigilance, but chronic stress often led to exhaustion, impaired judgment, and vulnerability. Physical injury or illness could strike at any moment, and medical care was scarce or non-existent on the road. Each journey demanded not just endurance but resilience against uncertainty. Economic instability added further pressure. Payment was modest and often delayed, yet the stakes of failure were high. You were expendable, easily replaced by another messenger. If you faltered, loyalty and reliability were critical, yet recognition was scarce. Your labor-shaped kingdoms facilitated commerce and preserved alliances, but your contribution was largely invisible. Despite these hardships, the messenger's work was indispensable. Couriers enabled trade, maintained governance, and preserved lines of communication that were essential to society. Your efforts sustained communities, armies, and dynasties, yet they existed in the shadows, recorded only in brief mentions or not at all. The life of a messenger exemplified endurance, discretion, and courage without reward or acclaim. Over time, adaptation became second nature. You learned to navigate difficult terrain, anticipate dangers, and conserve energy. Routes became familiar, Timing became precise, and judgment sharpened. Yet no amount of experience could eliminate uncertainty. Each new assignment carried risk, reinforcing the precarious nature of your existence. As the decades passed, the legacy of your work endured quietly. Messages delivered accurately shaped political decisions, facilitated trade, and sometimes prevented disasters. Yet the sacrifices, physical strain, and personal risk that enabled these outcomes remained largely invisible to those who benefited from your labor. Your life was one of quiet heroism, essential yet unrecognized, a testament to human endurance under pressure. Reflecting on this life, it becomes clear that the medieval messenger occupied a precarious space between survival and service. Physical danger, mental strain, political complexity, and economic instability defined every day. You may leave this story considering how information, mobility, and trust were so fragile in the past, and how individuals like you bore the weight of society's most critical communications.